Sekiro was released not so long ago, and with it came the traditional flood of articles and videos arguing that although the game seems cool and people want to love and enjoy it, they're simply unable to do so because it's too hard, too punishing, and too rigid in the options it affords them. And I do get it, because it is hard. It's really hard. I think it's the hardest game Miyazaki and From Software have made yet. There seems to be a few different kinds of complaints around this area. One is more related to accessibility concerns and how the game has no real options to make it more accessible for people who may have disabilities or other difficulties interacting with the demanding controls and the fast-paced combat. I think that's hard to argue with, and it's something other people are much better placed than me to talk about. What I'm interested in for the purposes of this video is the idea that there should be more traditional in-game difficulty options. What I mean by that is things like a slider that determines how much health the enemies have or how much damage your character is able to do. In an older game, maybe you'd start with more lives, more continues, that kind of really basic modulation that just sort of allows players to make more mistakes without losing any progress, or simply to get through areas with more ease due to there being less enemies or more checkpoints. You get the idea. Sekiro doesn't really have anything like this, and neither did Dark Souls. Now, as everyone on the internet is fond of reminding people who bring up this subject, these games are supposed to be challenging. They're supposed to offer players a sense of accomplishment for overcoming difficulty or for learning the sometimes arcane ins and outs of the mechanics. This is just how they're designed. But that doesn't mean that Miyazaki wants players to be turned away or to feel unable to progress in them. In fact, he's on record as saying the opposite. And sure, of course he wants players to enjoy his game. That's what they're for. But you do quickly come to see that there's a bit of a conflict here. If you just select easy mode at the main menu, and the game removes enemies, makes others much weaker, makes a player character much stronger, you're restricting the available space in which players may be able to feel accomplished or to feel that sense of mastery, because there's no longer the same kind of hurdles to overcome. Sure, the game might still be fun, but you're kind of undercutting one of the core design goals, and that's without getting into the possible side effects this could have on atmosphere, or the player's slow appreciation and mental mapping of these worlds, which I think is a really important part of them. What I want to argue is that while I think it would probably be possible to add these kind of traditional difficulty options to both of these games without completely ruining them, you don't actually have to do it with Dark Souls because it already has all this stuff built in, it's just that none of it's in a menu. While Sekiro and Dark Souls share a lot of the same systems, they also differ quite drastically in some key ways. The most important one when it comes to difficulty, in my opinion, is that Sekiro is far less of an RPG than Dark Souls was. If you're stuck on a boss, you're just sort of stuck. You can't go away and grind levels, you can't summon a co-op partner, you can't try different builds, different pieces of armour or rings to give you that tiny little advantage that might see you through a tough fight. So, in this regard, difficulty options in Sekiro would really help people who find themselves completely stuck, because there isn't anything else they can do apart from pure practice and purely learning the mechanics of the section or boss they're stuck on. You could argue that that's the whole point of the game, and maybe, but realistically, not everyone is starting from the same place, and sometimes people just need a bit of help. Dark Souls offers players this help in various smart and embedded ways, which we'll get onto a little later. Sekiro, on the other hand, does not. With that said, what would traditional easy mode options that don't totally suck look like in these games? Well, what if bonfires were all kindled one level above where they normally are by default? What if the healing gourd started with 6 uses instead of 3? What if the soul cost for levelling was reduced? What if they just deleted the Bed of Chaos? What if you lost a smaller percentage of skill points and sen upon death? What if Curse killed the player but didn't reduce their maximum available health? What if status effects in general built up a bit slower on the player, giving them more time to react? And what if Lautrec smoked weed? To take those ideas as some examples, do you really think any of them would completely ruin the challenge? Or would they just make the game a bit more forgiving and a bit more approachable? If you're a big boy and you're annoyed about other people getting to finish the game on an easier difficulty setting than you managed to, and well done by the way, then maybe you could tie these to different achievements, or hide an extra boss or a small area away at the end of the game for the normal and even hard difficulty settings, and just small extra incentives to try and beat the game with the intended difficulty balance in place. I think this would fit pretty well into Sekiro, but like I said earlier, even though you could add this stuff to Dark Souls, it already does something smarter. One of the many very cool things about Dark Souls is how a lot of the in-game systems are actually woven into the narrative and the wider world, so you can ask questions about the relationships between souls and character strength, about bonfires and homeward bones, about the undead curse and character respawning, and so on, and actually get answers, or at least as close as Dark Souls gets to concrete answers about anything. Obviously it's still a video game, and so some things you just have to accept exist because of that, or because of technical constraints. You know, why is there a floating two-dimensional HUD following your character around? In my opinion, it's probably something to do with the Lord Vessel. In this spirit, there are difficulty modulators also built into the game. Now up front I should say that there is technically one I alluded to before, that of simply being able to grind for more levels in order to make whichever part of the game you're stuck on a little bit easier. This is obviously a very common thing in games, and I would never go out of my way to applaud one for offering grinding like it's some kind of positive or fun activity. However, it is in there, and you can do it if you really, really want to. A more interesting, and in fairness much discussed example, is the jolly cooperation. If you're really having a miserable time, you can summon a player, or in some situations, an NPC to help you out. This can drastically alter the difficulty of a level or a boss, but is still somewhat balanced. Somewhat. For example, the effectiveness of summoning depends entirely on who it is you manage to find. There's nothing more disappointing than waiting for ages to find a summon, only for them to die immediately, leaving you alone against a boss that now has an increased health pool. Summoning also opens you up to invasions from other players, which can similarly ruin your day. Another thing you can do with humanity items is kindling bonfires, which has the effect of granting you more Estus charges up to a maximum of 20, which is a huge number that most players may never really need, but it's in there, it's tied into the story, and it's all player driven. The direction you choose to take your character also has a huge impact on this. You could roll into the final boss room dressed in nothing but your pants, with 5 Estus charges, intent on beating Gwyn to death with your bare fists. Or maybe you'll step through that final fog gate dressed head to toe in stone armour, with a small army of summons, 20 Estus charges, a shield the size of a door, and a gigantic anime sword. If you are playing Sekiro, your loadout is pretty much always the same. You can't even choose to run around in your pants, which is honestly mildly upsetting and a huge missed opportunity for the game. None of this stuff in Dark Souls is available in a menu before the game even starts. It's all woven into the game's systems and presented to the player gradually as they progress throughout Lordran. Players may naturally lean towards wearing heavy armour and blocking attacks with a shield without ever really being aware that they're effectively choosing an easier way to play. They might kindle every bonfire because it seems useful, without really thinking that they're decreasing the difficulty of the surrounding area by doing so. This kind of difficulty modulation, via choices made in-game, using systems which are either explicitly tied to combat and attack or defense numbers, or implicitly entwined with the narrative is, I think, something that stands out as a particularly elegant way of catering to different players and their disparate abilities or preferences, even in an already very elegant game. Now, I love this stuff, but it's definitely not perfect. I think the biggest problem with leaning on this kind of solution for difficulty modulation is that to really take advantage of it requires a player to learn about and experiment with it. You can kindle bonfires right from the start of the game, but there's no tutorial about it. And if you're really struggling and want those extra Estus charges all the way up to 20, well, you're going to have to descend all the way through the catacombs and beat a boss, which you'd have no way of knowing about until you'd already done it once. This helps a lot to make this feel natural and keep everything player driven, but it kind of sucks if you're just starting out and really just need some help right away, and you never get far enough to learn about and take advantage of these systems. I vividly remember my first time in the Undead Burg, flicking through the menus, just utterly lost. What does humanity do exactly? What's that number in the top left of the screen? How does kindling work? What does poise mean? What if Lautrec smoked weed?
Despicable.
Here's my extremely smart and neat solution. This stuff should all be left in the games because it's great fun to puzzle out on your own, and it adds so much to the atmosphere, the sense of isolation and mystery, and everyone hates tutorial messages, right? But maybe just include extra help as to how these systems work in the menus for people who do want to read it. Maybe like a mini instruction manual. You wouldn't have to spell everything out, but just some core things that are likely to confuse people for no good reason. I remember Xenoblade Chronicles X had something similar like this, and honestly it was a godsend in that game. I think if this is done well, then you can avoid the need for explicit difficulty settings entirely. I have no idea what future Dark Souls style games from From Software will look like, but I'll bet they'll make some, and in true Dark Souls style, I'll bet everyone will have this exact same conversation all over again.